a typical person thinks of France, he or she pictures symbols like the Eiffel Tower, baguettes, berets, and champagne. While these nationalist symbols may seem significant in the eyes of a foreigner, the national identity in France has been widely contested through globalization and anti-imperialism. The French Republic has evolved since decolonization and has undergone numerous changes to the French Constitution, but the issue of French nationalism persists today. French citizens struggle with the ongoing process of globalization while simultaneously fearing migration and radical Islamist terrorism. As a result, strikes and protests have become a major force for change. Strikes and protests serve as a way for French citizens to demonstrate their grievances with political, social, and economic institutions. They have become a nationalist symbol of Frenchness through their ability to enact change. In this video, I will be discussing the ways that strikes and protests have served as nationalist movements in France, while also depicting the instability of French identity and how it has grown more unstable since the end of World War II. France is a republic led by a president and a prime minister. Currently, the French president is Emmanuel Macron, and the French prime minister is Edouard Philippe. The national motto in France is Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. France also prides itself on being a secular state, and many of its laws display the distinction between religion and society. France also has a rich history. During the Renaissance, French culture flourished and a global colonial empire was established. The 16th century was dominated by religious civil wars between Catholics and Protestants. France became Europe's dominant cultural, political, and military power in the 17th century under Louis XIV. In the late 18th century, the French Revolution overthrew the absolute monarchy, established one of modern history's earliest republics, and saw the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which dictates a nation's ideals that still exist today. In the 19th century, Napoleon took power and established the First French Empire. His subsequent Napoleonic Wars shaped the course of continental Europe. After the collapse of the Napoleon Empire, France experienced a tumultuous succession of governments, ending with the establishment of the French Third Republic in 1870. France was one of the Allies in World War II, but was occupied by Germany in 1940. The Fifth Republic, led by Charles de Gaulle, was formed in 1958 and remains today. Strikes and protests became prominent after the French Revolution and the beginning of the French Republic. However, they truly took off as a nationwide trend after the 1950s. Historian Michael F. LaRousse details the breakdown that led to collective activism when he said, "In the wake of decolonization in the 1950s, profound social changes in the 1960s, and the end of a 30-year cycle of economic expansion in the 1970s, these issues became the source of considerable anxiety. A number of factors helped turn this anxiety into a full-blown national identity crisis between the 1980s and 1990s. The growing appeal of the National Front and the alleged ghettoization of the peri-urban suburbs were seen as evidence that France was no longer willing or able to assimilate with its most recent immigrants." After the conclusion of World War II, France experienced three major strike waves. These strike waves greatly affected two different genres of workers, the proletarians of manufacturing and transportation, and the educated professionals of the science sector. During the first of the three waves, which occurred between 1947 and 1949, France experienced a joining of two types of mobilization: revolutionary industrial federations calling out their forces to topple the government, and white-collar workers mobilizing without central orchestrations and for reasons other than political confrontation. The second strike wave, which took place in 1953, focused on the status of workers within the public sector and led to strikes having a new political role. Contenders for power used the strike as a method to advance its case. These contenders were comprised of the professional class created by industrial modernization. The final strike wave that took place during the post-war period was one of the most prominent examples of strikes and protests in France, the May 1968 protests. The May 68 protests began when students at two campuses of the University of Paris campaigned for changes in student life and wanted more agency in how their university was governed. Quickly, however, a violent confrontation between police and student protesters in Paris gave way to a nationwide general strike involving 11 million workers, and citizens across the country disputed their labor rights, turning the conflict into a political crisis. Transportation halted. There was no gas for cars because the refineries stopped producing, the trains did not run, nor did the Paris metro. Many believed that de Gaulle's government and the Fifth Republic were doomed. Before the May 1968 protests, French revolutions had primarily been political. These student-led protests, however, were culturally and socially based, and in a stunningly short time changed French society. However, in a broader sense, students were not just protesting for educational reform, they also protested against capitalism, American imperialism, and Charles de Gaulle's conservative policies. During this pivotal moment, the enemy of change was the government, and Charles de Gaulle seemed to be overwhelmed by the end of May, when he fled the country and publicly announced that he would resign if it was in France's best interest. Upon returning to France, however, de Gaulle doubled down on protesters and addressed the public on radio. His speech was well received, and de Gaulle was re-elected as president the next year. However, de Gaulle resigned the following year, proving that while protesters did not win the battle, they won the war. The spring of 2018 marked the 50th year reunion of the May 68 uprisings, and 1968 still remains a model for how ordinary citizens can utilize their power to rattle French politicians and change society. Once again, a new wave of protests and strikes have caused defiant rebellion within the country. During this round of strike waves, the French are against President Emmanuel Macron. Macron promised to change the country upon his election, but has yet to capitalize on his promises. More specifically, Macron promised to unify the disparate rules governing French public pensions. While his administration has pushed through a number of reforms over the past 11 months without difficulty, the country is not impressed by the changes he has made. Additionally, Macron has been nicknamed the president of the rich due to his inability to connect with ordinary French citizens. In a similar way as during 1968, the French are contrary to their president's lack of action towards the growing issue of globalization. This issue is exacerbated by the growing tensions and distrust between the French government and unionization. The Fifth Republic of France consists of a majoritarian electoral system and a weak parliament, so opposition and pressure from trade unions is the main political problem that the government faces as it tries to make reforms. Pressure from trade unions in France has a transitory nature and relies on public opinion for its power. More recently, the Yellow Vest riots are currently ongoing. They were caused when Macron announced a proposal to increase fuel taxes. When Emmanuel Macron offered economic concessions in the form of tax cuts and a higher minimum wage, French citizens did not feel that these concessions were sufficient. Additionally, high school and college students disagree with Macron's changes to new standardized testing policies, a lack of college enrollment places available to graduates, and new requirements for graduates to secure those places. So they are joining in the protest by setting fires and blockading schools around the nation. Last week, students were arrested on video while protesting against proposed overhauls to national exams. This event mimics the night of the barricades during May 1968, when almost 500 demonstrators were arrested and hundreds more injured. Evidently, strikes and protests have exposed the issues within French institutions while promoting and effecting change. In conclusion, French nationalism has been significantly skewed by insecurities resulting from globalization and the fear of Americanization. French citizens want their nation to hold onto autonomous power and the idea of traditional French ideologies and culture. Thus, they have turned to collective activism to oppose government changes. Lately, the protests and strikes have involved economic and social structures surrounding workers' rights and wages. This issue coincides with the unstableness of national identity because lower-wage workers believe that their jobs, wages, and hours are being taken by immigrants. For example, the 35-hour law, which limits the amount of hours French citizens are allowed to work per week, symbolizes the zero-sum approach to social problems so commonly seen in France, beginning from the premise that one person's loss of 4 working hours per week was necessarily another's gain. The factor of radical Islamist terrorism also affects French citizens' opinions on immigration and globalization because it is so prevalent across Europe. As globalization increases through technological, economic, and political advancements, France may experience more discontent surrounding the dynamic between Republican traditions like protests and migration and globalization.